Today, we're going to talk about research methods in psychology. Different from usual, I will usually include a lot of citations, but this time I'm just gonna mention about my professor, Dr. Giller. A lot of them are just textbook knowledge, so I'm just gonna cite her as the source. And before we get started, I'm going to tell you something. And you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you. And that's okay. You have good reasons not to. But I need you to keep listening. Regardless of what you believe, I don't care if you're liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between. I don't care if you're a dog person or cat person, morning person or night owl, iPhone or Android, Coke or Pepsi. I don't care. All I care is that you listen to this to the end. You may have heard that George Washington had wooden teeth. He lost most of his teeth in his 20s and had a set of dentures made from wood. Except it isn't true. In 2005, so there's this museums, they use laser scan to look at Washington's teeth denture, and they found them to be made out of horses, donkeys, and cows' teeth, and also human beings. And others, this is from New York Times, insisted that his embarrassment about his dentures, which sometimes caused him to hiss as he spoke and made him reclusive. Upon learning this information, I want to ask you something. How did it feel to learn this new fact about George Washington's teeth? So I stated a statement and I provided with evidence of that statement. And presumably, you now believe in it or not. And presumably, your belief about George Washington's teeth has changed with little or no friction, which means you're not having a strong reaction about it. Like you're not strongly against this belief. Terrific. So maybe in the future, you might go to a party and then every time when conversation about George Washington, you might mention about this fun fact about his dentures. Now, what if I told you George Washington had another set of false teeth? What if I told you that it was made from the teeth of slaves? Upon learning about this information, I want to ask you something. So again, how did it feel for you to learn about this new fact about George Washington's? Any more of that friction I mentioned earlier, you probably have a lot more friction after learning about his teeth is made from slaves. But I'm not here to convince you that Washington was a bad person. In fact, I can do research and do cherry pick sources and cite different sources to, deify or demonize George Washington. I can paint him very beautifully, or I can portray George Washington as a demon. Like I said, I don't care, and that's not the point. The point is to give you an emotional response when presented with new information. You may have noticed that the first fact about George Washington that I presented, that his teeth denture was made from donkeys and cows, was rather easy to accept. But when I told you about his slaves' teeth, you probably have, immediately questioned about this fact, or even feeling a little bit angry. Well, let's try a few more, but this time pay attention to how you feel. Columbus didn't discover America. It was actually Norwegian. Jesus Christ was not born on December the 25th, and Christ was not his last name. The Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist. So think about how you felt when you were presented with those facts. And here are some of the questions that I proposed. So why do we easily soften to some facts, but not to the others? So you probably have a softer response when you heard Jesus was not born on December the 25th, but the Pledge of Allegiance was written by socialists. Is a little bit harder for you to digest. And why do we become furious when presented evidence counter to our beliefs? Why do we ignore the evidence but instead we dig deeper and believe more firmly about the opposite idea? For example, the socialist. And why would providing more evidence to you can make someone less likely to believe? I cannot count, but if we can have an estimated amount of statements, facts, ideas that we have to encounter every day, that's probably a lot of ideas, a lot of statements. And some of them, we are able to receive very quickly, and some of them might challenge us, and some of them might even make us pretty angry. What you just experienced is called backfire effect. And backfire effect is when we present an information about something that's contradictory to your belief, usually like core value, something that you strongly believe to be truth. And the backfire effect explains that you're more likely to actually believe what the opposite side of the statements. And I think at this point we can conclude that when we are presented with statements, facts, ideas, we have our rational mind, and we also have emotional response. And sometimes it's a little hard to predict. But how are we dealing with all the facts that we see every single day? And as a matter of fact, we are surrounded by facts every day. Like, I just did a little quick Google. So here's one post: why you shouldn't wear a face mask when you're healthy, and bring foods that can make you smarter. In a lot of cases, so this is from CNN, I think. Black people are more racist than white people, and junk food blue are depression and diet related to each other, and is proposed by a clinic. And what are the best ways to learn, and especially when we see research back tips, how can we be more rational when we are facing all of these ideas every day? And how do we know if they are just ideas or there's even a higher motive behind all of those that is trying to convince you and shape your belief systems, or even challenge your core values and your core beliefs? So that's where this belief and scientific evidence comes in. We can explain it with psychology. So here are the methods of knowing. So tenacity, intuition, authority, rationalism, empiricism. The first one, tenacity, it's basically believing something because it's like a cultural traditions for you. For example, 7 is the lucky number, like very superstitious. Intuition is your gut instinct, so your immediate insight without observation or reason. And sometimes it can serve good purpose. For example, you want to have a good intuition as a doctor when you have no time to flip over to check your textbook, or you need a good intuition as a chef, so you know how many amount of salt to put without doing the check every time. Authority is believing something because we've been told by trusted authority. For example, a clinic or researcher or even psychology textbook. So usually they will present like study shows or research shows. And rationalism and empiricism, so they are kind of the opposite. So rationalism is discovering the truth by thinking about it. So through rational reasoning and analysis. And empiricism is our knowledge comes from senses. For example, we hear, we see, and we gather the facts through observation and scientific experiments. So both of these are, rather rational, we believe, because of A than B, but except rationalism does not involve any practical observation, but empiricism involves practical observation to prove something to be the truth. So to look deeper into the difference between these two, so we have this model. So the thinking process behind rationalism and empiricism is if A, then B. Rationalism is based on logic and intuition. So this conclusion that I have is based on very rational logic and intuition, basically thinking. And empiricism is believe something to be truth or prove something to be truth based on science and observation. And you may find yourself, not very distinct into one side or the others. So rationalism is thinking, empiricism is observing, and you might find yourself somewhere in the spectrum. And even rationalism, you might have, a large amount of logic and with little intuition, or a large amount of this and that. Or you can be, empiricism. So it doesn't matter. But here are kind of breaking down the methods of knowing, like how we come to believe into something. And if you follow me through the previous weeks, we talked about a lot on cognitive, social cognitions, how our thinking is errorful. So if you want more in-depth explanation, you can go back to my heuristic slides. So this is just like a brief recap. So availability heuristic is assume the likelihood of something based on how easily it comes to mind. For example, you are probably going to have a harder time to think about words with the third letter that involves R, or the words that starts with R, for example, word. And representative heuristic is to, classifying something based on the category that it belongs, and you classify that based on the typical traits. For example, Berkeley student must love boba. Confirmation bias, the tendency that when we believe in something, we will search for evidence to support what we believe. And puritanical bias. So this is something more subtle, but it's attribute the cause of an undesirable outcomes, for example, being homeless or one's wrongdoing, to a moral deficiency or lack of self-control, rather than, considering the, the systemic reasoning behind the circumstances. For example, people on the street, people on welfare must be lazy, not because maybe something happens to them. So, and there's tons of biases. This is just a tip of an iceberg. If I listed all of those, I think there's like 50 of those, but maybe another time we can go deeper. So are we really that reliable, our thinking? Can we still rely on our own reasoning and rational? And I would doubt that. So here comes the purpose of studying research methods, because our thinking is errorful and the information that we are exposed to It's not always the truth. Like I just told you, George Washington's teeth, and that was fake, obviously. The purpose is when we are presented with a statement, we're inclined to have emotional response sometimes, and sometimes those emotions can get in the way. But you know, the emotions are valid and tangible, but we can't just solely rely on emotions as a direct indication of knowing the truth. And studying research methods can also, you know, help us to able to process information more critically and think more independently. And like I said, we need a right amount of rationale to combat the biases and the heuristics that we may encounter. In fact, we encounter that every week and all the time. And this is probably for people in academia. So to conduct research, to testify or falsify a belief, a hypothesis, a statement, to prove or disprove something is right or wrong. And basically, we need to have this skill set to, you know, really fact check the things that we encounter every day. To go to the basic of scientific methods, here are the 6 steps how we conduct research. First, we pose a question. Then we formulate a hypothesis, you know, based on educated guess. And then we generate a prediction, and we make systemic observations to prove or disprove our hypothesis. And then we interpret the observations to, or sometimes we need to revise our hypothesis, have a new hypothesis, and then go back to step 1 and do it over and over again. A side note, the difference between science and religion, actually they are not conflict to each other. So, well, this is my belief, religion is always truth. It doesn't, we cannot disprove that. But science is like, we always have to disprove this hypothesis to be wrong. Maybe after you disprove your hypothesis 150 times or 1,000 times, and finally you come to a conclusion, and then you have a theory and you have a statement that is proven to be truth. Now let's look at some basic research concepts. So very basic. So construct is like a psychological concept that cannot be measured directly. For example, love, fear, attachment, intelligence is like a concept, and they're not concrete material that we can see or detect in the visible world. But how can we work with these concepts and prove them in an experiment? So we need to, you know, operationalize this and come up with different variables. Variable is something that can be changed, and it's usually characteristic can be assumed in multiple values. For example, let's say we have this construct of intelligence. We can say the variable of intelligence is the GRE test or the SAT test, something that's more tangible that we can see. And then we have research questions, so asking about the relationship between 2 or more constructs. And we have hypotheses, specify what we think that relationship is, again, educated guess. And then we have prediction, if A, then B, and specify what we should observe if the hypothesis is true. And then we have measurements. So it's a development of procedures to measure people's characteristics like intelligence or a personality test. And then we have sampling. So sampling is selecting a representative group from the population under study. And there's a lot more to it in the whole research process, but these are just some of the representative terms that I want to mention. Here we have a population. So we were talking about population and sample. Sample is just taking a small amount of your target population, and that can represent the whole population. And the target population, we can say, is the total group of individuals from which the sample might be drawn. And generalizability is the extent to which we can apply the findings of the research to the target population. Basically, if your theory works in this group of 50 participants, it should also work for the greater population, let's say this whole country or this whole group of people representing that characteristics. And sampling bias is the sample does not reflect the characteristics of the target populations. You know, in today's, there's a lot of sampling bias could happen in university because a lot of the psychology experiment is actually done, a lot of them is done by giving extra credit to psychology students. So a lot of the people are psychology students who's in their early 20s. So that can be a sampling bias, but depends on what you need to control. And then random sampling. So everyone in the entire target population should have an equal chance of being selected. And let's go back. This might seem a lot, but I can explain it with a very quick examples. Remember the very last presentation that I did a couple weeks ago? I had this question, why are some people always stay single? So that is a research question that I have. And to understanding why, I need to, you know, take an educated guess. Maybe I can, based on my observation, based on my reasoning, I can probably have this hypothesis. Oh, maybe people who are always single is because they have a higher education level. So then I can have a hypothesis. People with a higher education level tend to marry later in their life, and that is a prediction. And I can measure that by having a target population, people who has a master degree or doctorate degrees, and see how that will correlate with their marital status, relationship status. Does that make sense? Cool. So very important things. I always talk about IV, DV, but finally I will explain to you. So independent variable and dependent variable is, think of it as independent variable is something that the researcher want to control. And so any variable that the researchers intentionally manipulate and across conditions. And then we randomly assign these conditions, and then we have dependent variables. So after random assignments to different participants to have different independent variables, and the dependent variable is the result of independent variable. So and DV is basically any variable that the researchers measure as an outcome of the study, generally thought to be the effect of the manipulation of the independent variable. And if you remember, there's a study way back that I talked about in social cognition slides. So, you know, Hannah is an actor, and the participant was watching the video clip of Hannah playing in the first IV is in the rich neighborhoods, and then the second IV is Hannah playing in the poor neighborhoods. And then they show the clip of Hannah doing IQ test with very vague performance. And the dependent variables of that study would be, the participant will have to guess what grade Hannah was in, and those who saw Hannah was playing in a poor neighborhood, they reported Hannah to be 1 grade lower than those participants who saw Hannah playing in a rich neighborhood, which is biases on intelligence. So I hope that makes sense. And here's another experience, very, very famous psychology experiments. So Asch conformative experience. And so basically they invited people, and they have confederate, and they have the participant, which is naive participant, had no idea what was going on. And they asked this question. So the line S is equal to which line. And let's just watch the clip.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2,
2,
2,
2,
2, 3,
3,
3,
3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2,
2,
2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct. In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group.
All right, so you get the idea of this experiment. So now if we put that into the, the terms, so the terms that we just learned. So in this experiment, the construct is they're trying to measure social pressure, conformative peer pressure, and see how likely people are conforming to others. And the hypothesis of this experiments, proposed by Asch, is participants will change their answers in order to conform to how others in the group responded. And this is just me quoting him. And the sampling is 50 male students from this university. And the independent variable is Confederates response with incorrect answers. And the DVs is either the naive participant responded with correct or incorrect answers. So which means conform or not conform. And the findings of this strikingly shocked to me. So over 12 trials, about 75% of the participants would conform to at least once, and then 25% of them never conform. And well, I'm not gonna talk too much about the studies, but here just give you an idea of how these terms comes to life in an experiment. And there's also validity in research. So validity is basically, are you measuring what you claim to measure? And there's internal validity and external validity. So an experiment should fulfill both. So internal validity is causal relationship between the IV and the DV. So is IV really causing DV? So how sure are you that IV is caused by IV? DV is caused by IV instead of some other factors. And external validity is results can be generalized and applied beyond the study itself. So including other people, other researchers can replicate the studies and have the same results and the real world. So let's talk about this problem of third variable. And we also call that confound in psychology term. So the third variable is an unidentified variable that's responsible for the observed relationship between the two other variables. Very simple analogy. So we have variable 1, ice cream consumption, and variable 2, murder rates. And so now what you're seeing, ice cream consumption is correlated with murder rates. But what we don't see is there could be potential third variable that is affecting this variable is both affecting ice cream consumption and murder rates, which we can imply maybe temperature. So when it's hot, people eat ice cream. When it's hot, people have bad temperaments and they go out and commit crimes. And this is another thing widely discussed amongst today. So let's see, mask. So this is what I saw today on YouTube. They say that mask is ineffective in preventing COVID, but it didn't say anything about the third variables. I watched the whole videos, the news, which can be, you know, age, ethnicity, breastfeeding, medical conditions, immune system, even your diets. A lot of the things has to, you know, taken into account when we are making a statement A cause B. So we need to adapt the thinking of, you know, systemic thinking, like what else is out there that is causing this causal relationship. There's also a problem of directionality. So when two variables are related, but it's unknown which is the cause, which is the effect. So here's one, watching violent TV and aggressive personality. Well, they might somewhat related, but it's hard to tell. Does watching violent TV cause aggressive personality, or does aggressive personality cause a person to watch violent TV? We have no idea. Let's look at some other confounds, and this is like a training opportunities for you guys to think systemically. So we have this hypothesis or research questions. Which drink is more effective in promoting productivity for college students? Is it Red Bull or is it coffee? Let's say we are all researchers here right now, and then we're trying to conduct this study to answer this research question. So we have independent variable here. So we randomly assign participant to drink. Here, group A, you drink Red Bull. Group B, you drink coffee. And then you go study for an amount of time. And then the dependent variable, which is the outcome, is look at the exam scores of group A drinking Red Bull and group B drinking coffee. So can any of you tell me what can be a potential third variables, a potential confounds that is affecting the validity of this study?
How much they slept, how much they studied. Whether they like Red Bull, whether they like coffee.
True. So you point out there's individual differences, you know, preference, and also their own physiological states that can affect. Like here in the picture, I can think of on the back of my mind is Red Bull is usually served cold and coffee is usually served hot. Maybe that can be a confound too. So there's a lot of things going on, and we can't just make the assumptions of Red Bull is better than coffee, but there's a lot of things we should consider, especially as a researcher. So like the temperature of the drinks, participants, caffeine tolerance, something's more subtle, or even the time of the exams. Maybe some students are morning person or not morning person, and the amount of waters the participant had, and the list can go on and on. Here are some of the common sources of confounds, include but not limited to. So first one, environment, the place or setup of the experiment changes across conditions, and individual differences. So for example, maybe the participant was thinking, oh, I'm being tested, that's why I will purposely not act based on what I would normally act, maybe due to nervousness, or it can be anything. The passage of time, for example, morning person, you do this experiments, or over time when you're doing this, for example, you want to test the effects of this intelligent improvement programs that you design. But maybe the passage of time can be a confound because over time you get more practice, you have more exposures. So it can affect the dependent variables validity. So the history, for example, you are testing this neighborhood's math skills, but maybe you should take in consideration that maybe this neighborhood, they have this after school program and they came to this study pretty prepared for their math skills. Maturation, so if you're doing a study on developmental psychology, so you study about humans' development. Let's say, for example, teens' frontal lobe, they will mature over time if you're doing a longitudinal study, which is a study over time instead of just one-time study. And this instrumentation. So this is the way a variable is measured, changes and affects the DV. So for example, they change the test used to determine math proficiency over time. For example, the student coming from UK, they're not used to studying SAT. And there's order effects. Experience in the first treatment causes a change in subject that affects subject's performance in subsequent conditions. For example, I remember one time I was doing this study at school and they had me doing this test to test my reaction time. I had to go there for 10 times and I knew over time I was getting better and better at it. So there's a lot of things we need to consider when we are trying to prove something scientifically. So how do we control these confounds then? So this is one strategy. We need to have counterbalancing. A very direct strategy some people will use is matching. So ensure the average value of the confound is the same across conditions of the study. For example, in the previous study we just mentioned, you can have cold coffee matches, iced coffee matches with cold Red Bull, and hot coffee matches with hot Red Bull to counterbalance this confound. And random assignment is really important. So that you don't eliminate the variation between the groups and everyone gets an equal chance to be selected. And in the group of being selected, everyone gets an equal chance to be distributed to different independent variables. Holding constant is not allow the potential confound to vary at all across participant or conditions. For example, if you're worrying about gender differences in your medical studies, then you only choose male participants to rule out the confound in gender. And these two things I want to address is kind of important. So there's two designs in psychology. So between subject design and within subject design. So between subject design is each participant only gets one chance to experience one condition, and that's it. And within subject design is, let's say there's multiple independent variables and each participant will have to experience all conditions. If you remember the relationship slides about attraction theories, we like those who are familiar. And I mentioned about the study is we have the Confederate students going to class, showing up 5 times, another group of students showing up 10 times, another group is 15 times and 0 time. And then there's 4 IV there. And then the DV is rate all of these Confederate students, how much we like them. And so that is an example of within subject design. So all participants is exposed to each condition of the independent variable. Again, include but not limited to. There's a lot more, but we don't have enough time. So now going back to the very first beginning of the narrative. Now I'm going to tell you something once again. And vaccinations can cause autism. It has been studied and researched by doctors in the field In fact, I have a list of all the names of these doctors. And there's a correlation between MMR vaccine with the development of autism. And I have a citation here. And here's one of the graph from that study. So we can see behavioral diagnosis and exposures to this MMR vaccine. So, but except it isn't truth. It's entirely fake. So this vaccine experiment was conducted by Wakefield from England. Oh, sorry, it's actually 1998. Sorry, not 2018. And if we really take a look inside of this study, we can see there's a lot of fraud to the study. So the first sample size is only 12 children, which is not representative and cannot be applied beyond a greater population. And there's also sample bias. You know, this 12 children is actually coming in to participate in this study already with autism. And the vaccine, so this is what I'm summarizing from the studies. So they are claiming that vaccine is causing this inflammation in the children's guts, and it produces some type of mystery protein, and this protein is affecting the developing brain, hence causing autism. Well, there's also another compound, which is the time compound. So the autism symptoms was actually already there before the inflammation symptoms amongst these children. And let's look at the internal validity. The protein that Wakefield claimed that the inflammation produced this protein is causing the brain development issues. It's very vague, basically, unobservable, unidentifiable. And so it failed to measure what it claimed to measure. Well, let's look at external validity. So the research cannot be generalized. The results cannot be generalized beyond the study itself. There has been a lot of study trying to reciprocate Wakefield study to trying to really figure out what's going on between vaccine and autism. So there has been study done in UK, have longer hours, a larger population, and we can see there's no correlation between autism and this MMR vaccine. In fact, Canadian children actually show the opposite results of decreased rates of autism when they receive the vaccine. And the generalizability, I mentioned this at the very beginning. So can this be applied to the target audience? So to children. So in this study, it cannot find correlation between autism and vaccine amongst a larger population. Therefore, Wakefield, along with I think 12 other doctors, all of their PhD degree has been suspended, and they were facing a lot of legal issues. Like there's another thing, you know, the ethic codes in being a researcher. So this is just my screenshot of the study. You can actually go, and if you want to go extra mile to fact check everything. Here's the study is completely being crossed away, retracted. So to conclude my presentation, if you don't remember anything that I just said, here are some of the final takeaways that you can take with you. You know, critical thinking is really important. Even though none of the things that I mentioned, DV, IV, hypothesis, research questions, result finding, how to interpret a graph, how do you do research, maybe none of us will ever have to become a researcher, but the benefits of learning that is to help you get in the mode of being very aware of your thinking and how can we be more rational and actually judge something in critical manners. For example, calculating likelihood, formulating inferences. For example, like law school, you don't go to law school and you have the exact case that you will face when you become a lawyer. But the purpose of law school is really help you to be adapted to think like a lawyer, if that makes sense. And correlation doesn't necessarily equals to causation. So we should always take it with a grain of salt. Is there third variables? And another takeaway is we should feel very comfortable about thinking. How many of you actually think about thinking? Like, oh, how will you do? Good for you. Maybe you read the book Thinking Fast and Slow. So if you want to be more aware, here is a really good book you can read. It can help you to be very aware about your decision-making process and your judgment, what's going on in your brain, and how not to be tricked by external factors like expert or by your own biases or your emotions. So here's one thing we can improve is to really feel comfortable about thinking. And when your core beliefs are being challenged, let it have its emotional response in your cortex. Then listen. Just like when you're meditating, you see a thought, you let the thought go away, but you don't do nothing about it. And then change your belief if you may, or if you don't want to change your belief. Actually, about the backfire effects, I did not have a lot of time to explain, but I'll give you some quick facts. So actually, USC, they conducted the backfire effects. They were giving the informations that potentially trying to challenge the participant, and then they were doing the brain scan, and they see parts of their brain that is response for survival, like when we perceive a dangerous situation in the physical, the same part of the brain is being activated. And so sometimes we just need to let the emotions to, it's okay to have those emotions, it's part of our instincts, but how not to let those emotions to really dictate our judgment and decision-making process. And it's impossible that every person we meet agree with us. In fact, there are 7.59 million of us that's not going to agree with us every single one of the time. And I'm not here to change your mind about anything, but I'm just here to tell you that it's okay. It's completely fine to embrace those who have different views than us. Perhaps we can pause for a moment and think critically without having judgment on individual, even if they challenge your core belief. And listening and understanding is beautiful. That's all I have to say. Thank you.